It's always delayed.
Well, and it confuses me because I can't, refresh the page, and everything in me just wants to refresh the page because I know it'll then come up. But I did that the other day and then I had
It
to like
breaks
start over.
everything.
So it happened. Okay. It's thinking. It's really thinking. Oh my goodness, it has one of those old school like dishes. Okay. Now I can fill it. And here we are. Perfect. And we are live. So, hello and welcome to Lunchable Go-to-Market Ops. We're your hosts, Sarah Lane-Hawn, and
Danielle Urban.
serving up grab and go HubSpot strategy every weekday in 15 minutes or less. In today's episode, we're actually going to be talking about attribution, and we're going to be talking about attribution all week. So today we're going to be diving into the what does it mean? What is attribution? What do we mean when we talk about it? And figured this is a good place to start before we get into the weeds. So Danielle, do you want to kick us off with kind of why we're digging into attribution, why it matters?
Yeah, I think it's so important to level set on terminology. I remember a meeting I was sitting in way back in the days of real offices, and I was like, "But what is a campaign? Somebody tell me. Everybody go around the room and tell me what you think a campaign means." And
Mm.
attribution is the same way because you've got, sales attribution for their pay, like the actual breakdown of who gets what in commission. You've got attribution in terms of, checking your marketing ROI. You've got attribution in terms of, just measuring all these different pieces. And then you've got layers of that where it's like, what kind of attribution do you want to do? And so I think just setting our conversation around a definition is probably the best starting point and best gift we can give everybody right now. And so, do you want to help give some context as to why you need to have this conversation about attribution?
Yeah, and it comes from very similar to what you're saying, right? Where you get everybody in a room and everyone has a different understanding of what attribution is. A lot of times you won't find that out until you're already trying to build some sort of attribution model. And then you'll get into the weeds of an example, and all of a sudden you'll realize that there's a huge disconnect. At least that's how it's happened with me in the past. And
Usually.
so I now start every attribution conversation this way and say, hey, what are we trying to measure and what business decisions are we going to make based on the output of this model? Before we even talk to you about what the model is or anything else, just what are we thinking? What are we trying to do? And from that, the most standard responses I get is either we're trying to determine what gets marketing credit and what gets sales credit as an open opportunity. Who's responsible for it? Which one do we bucket it under? How do we do that? Right. And so they'll have had some sort of first touch or last touch program in the past. They want to start building it out and having more detail, but that's the goal is we want to separate it into marketing credit or sales credit. The other alternative is somebody wanting to have actual revenue attribution, and this is usually coming from like the CFO, where they're saying no, like we're trying to make financial decisions, we're trying to go to the board, we're trying to get another round of funding. And so as we're doing that, we need to be able to say, hey, out of all of our primary channels, this is the revenue impact that that channel has had. And so both of those use cases, right, can be actually served with models, completely different models. Like there's a lot of options within those, but starting with that conversation is really helpful, I think, because a lot of businesses, um, one person might want the revenue breakdown, another person just wants marketing or sales credit, another person wants every single touch point in the universe measured, right? And wants to see a customer journey, and they really could care less about what the dollar figure is on the other end. They want to understand touch points. So as long as you understand it, then you can determine, is this one system? Is this three systems that we're building? Or can we combine it in some way?
Yeah, definitely. I'm usually coming at this from the marketing side. So my background being in demand gen, we always want to know how can we do more of the thing that works. And so there's step 0 of figuring out the thing that works. And that's usually the hardest part because that is attribution. And it's like,
Right.
well, that one thing that we did got us their name, but there was an anonymous touch before that. How did they come in from that? And there was the conversation that created a deal, or maybe the salesperson was just late in creating their deal and it came after the marketing follow up that followed an event. And so
Right.
then is it marketing or sales? And I like try to hold in all of my feelings on the marketing versus sales conversation because it just brings up some real trauma from my demand gen days. But everybody wants to know, how do we project out, how do we set goals for our sales team, how do we hold marketing accountable for revenue, which everyone wants to do. And hopefully, at least having those numbers as a baseline can keep everybody swimming in the same direction rather than sort of parsing out blame and finger pointing,
Yeah.
which happens quite often. But from the marketing perspective, we always want to know, where did it come from and why, and how do we do more of the thing that works? And so that's even one more layer. And that's why that conversation is so important. We can't answer what is attribution. Like at a baseline, attribution is just deciding where credit lies in
Hmm.
something.
Yep.
But when you really dive into it, it's who is the person looking for answers. That's how you start a lot of consulting engagements, is like, who needs what answer? Now let's figure out how to build that.
Yeah, and I think that's so important is as we start these conversations, sit down with the team of your full stakeholders, and determine what everyone is looking for and what only individual parts of the organization are needing, because there may end up being an overall attribution framework that you agree upon. I typically advise that to be revenue attribution and keep that as your cornerstone, but then that doesn't mean that you also don't need to do customer journey mapping and have something that's measuring that for marketing to be able to understand the early, impact of different activities. And it doesn't mean that you don't still need to have something where you're looking at number of touch points, that were sales versus marketing primary touch points, right? Like we can do a lot of things, but those might be three completely different builds. So being able to articulate that back, if you're the administrator, to the people saying like, okay, cool, we wanted attribution as an org. We also really want three different things. So if we start here, it will answer this particular question. If we add this on, it can then answer this question, but there is no one model that is truly going to answer every single one of our questions that we have. And so
Yeah.
I think that's impactful. In working within HubSpot, right? There's a lot there. So when we're talking attribution, both revenue attribution and really customer journey mapping. Um, those are tools that exist in Marketing Enterprise Hub. Most of my clients don't have Marketing Enterprise Hub. It's not a thing. They all use Pro. And then we create manual automated processes, right, to fill in the gaps. But I'm curious for you, as you're going through these conversations of what is attribution, what is it that we're trying to measure, like, is there a point at which, you know you do point people to built in or external even resources versus trying to build something from scratch just for them?
Yeah, definitely. I think it almost directly relates to how much they're spending in marketing. Again, most of my engagements start with the marketing team and end up bleeding into sales, service,
Yeah.
operations, whatever. And so I start off my consulting engagements working with the marketing team. And when we're doing that, they say, how do we do more of the thing that works? So we need to figure out, like, well, what is it that you want to measure? If you want to measure top of funnel awareness, then what HubSpot gives you out of the box is your original source properties for
Right.
how someone first found your content. And that is limited to digital touch points. So then it's like, well, what is your process for meeting people out in real life? How do they get put in? How do you mark where they came from? If you don't
Mm.
have a system for that, let's start to build one. And then the question is like, well, do we need to compare those things against each other? So do we create a sort of derivative property that combines real life with digital, and now you can measure all of that together? Or is there some, layers of properties that we need to create around that? But out of the box, you basically just get original source on your contacts. You do get record source as well. So you can start to figure out how those people got created, if they didn't come from a digital touch point. Was it an import? Was it a third party tool? Which third party tool was it? So you've got something to play with as long as you have your HubSpot implemented somewhat correctly. If it's installed, if you have it running on your website, you've got
Yeah.
something to start with. Then you do have the contact create attribution reports in Pro. I don't use those like ever. Like if I'm trying to analyze how contacts were created, it's usually for a very specific reason. And it's trying to say, like, well, how did that thing perform? How did that one thing perform?
All right.
But I don't think I've ever come into an account where we're like, oh yeah, original sources is all we've ever needed. Like we're
Yeah.
good. There's always some other layer, whether it's as basic as UTMs, if it's
Yep.
creating sort of that derivative summary property. But in a pro account, you're fairly limited to what's there, and it assumes that most of your interactions are online and
Mhm.
digital. I think you get deal create in pro as well. I'd have to look that up. But you do
I
get
know you get
some.
latest, like latest activity and latest interaction,
No, I
latest.
mean in the actual reports in a HubSpot Pro
Oh.
account. I'll have to look. You get two attribution reports in a pro account. And I want to say it's contact create is definitely one of them. And then it
Mhm.
might be revenue or deal create for the other one. But they're kind of difficult to understand.
Yeah.
So what
Yeah.
do you do when you move past that point of like, all right, well, this clearly isn't enough because you hit that point in the first 5 minutes?
Well, I think to your point, like being able to dive in and figure out what is the next layer that's needed, right? Maybe we don't tackle everything at once. We're not going to answer full revenue attribution at the same time as, original source, cleanliness, as well as opportunity source as a single, category, right? Like you're not going to do it all at once. But figuring out what the next layer is and building that in, I think is the easiest way to kind of have a stepwise clarity. And so, I have a lot of people who, when they're doing their own build, they'll start by having self-appointed attribution in their forms, right? Where
Hmm.
they'll just ask, where did you hear about us? Um, and while we know that is very rarely accurate, it is helpful because it does tell you the perception of how somebody heard about you, what they remember hearing about you. And so I think there is some value there in having that. But then integrating, those touch points with the digital touch points with the manual uploads and how all of those point to sources of contacts um, in a clean way, like doing some workflows to clear out that is really helpful. In addition to building that piece out, I do think a lot of people look for at least, at minimum, having multiple touch points where they're looking at the source. So, what's the last thing that happened before someone became an MQL? What's the
Hmm.
last thing that happened before an opportunity was created? And so, the first step there is I'll usually create some sort of placeholder field so that however we're running our latest source field, even if we're using HubSpot's default,
Data
we have
source.
somewhere else for it to land and kind of copy over if it is happening at an important moment so
Hmm.
that we can at least have 2 or 3 points along the customer journey that we can go back and analyze within Pro. And then, we can get crazy. We can build a whole revenue model in Pro. It's possible. But like, baby steps first. Make sure it's what you need before you go that far.
Yeah, totally agree. So to sum it up, um, the most important thing that you can do to start your attribution model is to ask, what are you even trying to answer?
Yep.
Figure out what your question is.
Ask, what is it? What are we building? I think that's a great place to end for today. Tomorrow, we'll start diving into how to get buy in. So, you need attribution, your company wants attribution. How do we get all of the stakeholders in the same room to understand the impact that it's going to have? Answer the question, what is it that we're actually building, and then figure out the next steps. So with that, I'm Sarah. This is Danielle. Thank you for joining us for another episode. See you tomorrow.